Wonderful. Welcome to the Silver Sirens Virtue Sanctuary. Thank you all for joining us today for this beautiful conversation with Kittu Randhawa, who is a domestic and family violence specialist. So I want to hand over to Kittu in a moment, but first of all, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country. And in my case, it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge any and all Aboriginal people present here today. So I'm going to hand over to Kittu, who's going to take us through this really informative session. Over to you, Kittu.
Thank you, Faith, and welcome everybody. I'm just going to go through my presentation. I'm sorry, I'm just going to stop for 1 second because I need to move my presentation to another screen. Hate it when this happens in a recording. My apologies there. Okay, I'll try that again, shall I? Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Kittu Randhawa, and I'm from ICSA, the Indian Subcontinent Crisis and Support Agency. I would like to start, of course, with acknowledging the First Nations people as the traditional custodians of the land that we're on, land that is, was, and always will be the land of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The land that I'm sitting on today is the Darug land, and it's my privilege to have lived here pretty much all of the time, my 30 years in Australia. But as a migrant organisation, we also pay respect to the fact that we come from countries of colonisation and have moved on from that, and we sit with the First Nations people in the reconciliation and recovery process. Of course, we pay our respects to their elders past, present and future. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about domestic and family violence. I've put some words up there for people to consider: recover, heal, live, grow and prosper. Because really, as a domestic and family violence worker, this is what our aim is. So just to give you some background on myself. So where do I come from and why do people say I'm a specialist domestic family violence worker? Wasn't always a domestic family violence worker. Started my life in logistics and procurement in defence. And from that, I've moved into state government, local government, and now in the community sector. And when I started in the community sector, when I found that there was a need for people who were coming as new and temporary migrants, and that they weren't being able to, what I thought was navigate the systems, and I've come to learn that there weren't some systems for them to navigate. So these days, over that time, I am the senior domestic and family violence caseworker. I'm also a subject matter expert in some of the cultural abuses. I'm a qualified family dispute resolution practitioner. I'm also a cultural consultant. And with all of the work that I do, in all of the work that we do as ICSA, we build a lot of expertise through vicariously living through people's experiences and understanding what they are going through. So our expertise doesn't come just from academia or from research or from anybody who is developing good practice guidelines. While we take a consideration of that, we have to work in a culturally informed way, and that's why we develop our own ways to work. So just quick housekeeping. If you wouldn't mind putting yourselves on mute, that would be great. But if you don't want to put your video on, that's perfectly fine too. If you want to ask questions, feel free to put them in the chat box as we go, but I will come back to them after I've finished, and then I'll cover all the questions. And there will be some opportunity at the end for you to ask questions. One of the things I have to say at the beginning is self-care is very important in whatever we do. So if you feel uncomfortable with what I'm talking about or the subject matter, please feel free to take a break and talk to somebody afterwards. So you can even call me afterwards if you want to. I'm not going to cover too many, hopefully, specifics, but in the conversation afterwards, we may get to that. So that's the self-care part. Okay, one of the first things that I want to talk about is the assumptions. And I think many of you, there's nobody who will really not have an assumption about domestic and family violence. Doesn't matter where on the spectrum you sit, who you talk to. But one of the first things that comes to mind when we talk about this is a little bit like the image that you're seeing. It's men perpetrating violence on women. And that is the most common factor that comes across, and that's what we're trying to prevent in the work that we do in the broader scale of things. But some of the other things that I want to raise is that we have a lot of terminology that we talk about. We talk about domestic and family violence. Faith started introductions with that, using that as well, and it's become the phrase at the moment. But we shouldn't forget that it's also domestic violence, which could be in any circumstance. We also call it family violence. We have terms like seniors abuse and child abuse. But mostly what we talk about, what that entails is anything that's happening within the intimate partner relationship or in a family scenario. We also have another aspect from the work that we do, and we call people just vulnerable people, and it's what they experience versus giving it a definition like domestic and family violence. So some of the people, partners are very, very much the first people that we look at as an intimate partner violence, which is already covered in the common phrases that you hear. But we also look at people's partners' families. Within a cultural framework, we see this quite a lot because people as in culturally diverse communities, they live in extended families, and therefore that partner's family is often a part of their relationship. So we include those people where a person can become vulnerable by that person. Also, it can be other members of the family. And if we take that into the context of the broader community, I think everybody who's had a friend who's gone through something like this, and we try to support our friends, we kind of become their allies, but at the same time, we can also start the blame game of what he did or they did and she did. So we have to be conscious that there's never just two people in this relationship of what's going on. There are wider and broader factors of that contribute to it. So within ethnic communities or culturally diverse communities, this can be impacted by other community members. So, and again, it doesn't just relate to culturally diverse communities. This can be anyone from the local priest. It can be from seeing, people not inviting others to a party or a gathering. What a lot of women do tell me is that, what really surprised them was that the normal social circle that they had, such as kids' parties, they weren't being invited to anymore. Their partner was being invited, but they weren't. And where children were invited, it was very specific that only the children were invited. So this kind of isolation can happen within the community, and that's a part of what goes on for an individual, which makes them even more vulnerable. The next one is employer. Employers, we have now 10 days of domestic and family violence leave that we can all access if you are experiencing any family violence. However, employers can also be part of the perpetration. And that can be done as in, some employers don't necessarily believe it. Some employers may think, well, this is downtime for me. What am I going to do? It's a commercial decision. But in other ways, it can also be unwittingly giving information to the offending partner without meaning to or realizing it. And we see this in financial abuse as well. So if the employer is paying money in terms of a salary sacrifice, that information is going to the partner, that if they've been doing the tax returns and things like this. So there's many different ways that a person can become more vulnerable. And when we start looking at the common phrase of domestic and family violence, and it's all intimate partner violence, when we start looking at it in terms of what is happening to an individual, it's much broader than that. So essentially, it's anybody who has a power over a person or controls an aspect of their life. So employment, again, is a really important one, because without employment, you don't have income, and without income, that compromises what an individual can do in the first place. So what we talk about in our organisation is, yes, there's definitely intimate partner violence or abuse, because that is really where it starts. But the abuse can happen within any domestic or personal setting or anything that you interact with. So in understanding what we are looking at in helping someone, when we talk about support for people, when we are told to ring a number as you can probably tell by this, that's a very small part of it. There's a much broader situation to understand and to put it in context for that person. So some of the formal definitions that we have, these Department of Social Services one is family and domestic violence is violent, threatening, coercive or controlling. It causes a person to be fearful. And I think that word at the end, fearful, is what must be at the forefront of our mind when we deal with anybody who discloses, whether it's as a friend or it's as a worker, is that person is going to be holding some form of fear. The other one that we do talk about these days is domestic and family violence is an act, one incident or a number of incidents of any kind of act of violence or threat. It can be multiple types of abuse, and that again causing a person to be fearful. So what this raises the question is that is domestic and family violence or any or some part of violence? And bearing in mind that for most people, the word violence actually has physical connotations and not other connotations. So I want to open your minds up to another way of looking at this. So I'm just going to put everything on the slide first, simply to give you the overall picture. So domestic and family violence ultimately has always been about control. And we've talked about this for years gone by. We've come up with a lot of new terminology for this, but ultimately it's about one person controlling another or others. When we're talking about coercive control now, we're starting to understand what is really happening. So when we look at coercive control, that person generally has some kind of strategy and some tactics to start perpetrating their behavior onto the other person. What their aims are underneath all of that, and that's why I put the clouds around it, it's really about dominating, entrapping somebody, subordinating them, causing them to be fearful, and to exploit their anxiety and their fear and their lack of confidence. And what we see happen in this is that, and this is why a lot of people don't get what really happens in domestic and family violence, is that they say, why doesn't she just leave? That's the easiest thing. This does not happen overnight. It couldn't happen to anybody overnight because it takes time to build this kind of thing up. And it doesn't necessarily involve any kind of physical violence. All these different ways, these tactics do come out in ways that we've now identified as forms of abuse. So these are the ones that are listed down in physical, sexual, intimidation, psychological, emotional, and I'm not going to list them all because this list keeps growing. We can pretty much take any kind of behavior these days and we can find ways, and we find ways that people use it for abusive purposes, whether it's sending a text message, whether it's stalking, whether it's just passing somebody in the street, looking at someone across the room. There are pretty much everything we do in our lives can be used to abuse or control or intimidate. So what happens in coercive control is the impact on the person is that they start to become, starting with fear, it starts to become perpetual fear. It starts to become anxiety, overriding everything. And when people are in that kind of situation, that's when it starts to affect their mind, how they think, how they manage themselves. All of that starts to happen in their head, and that's where the mental health starts to be affected. There's always the point of where they're worrying about what's going to come next, because the offender is generally quite manipulative and clever. So they know that one point has been achieved and then they'll move to another point. So that person, while they might expect that, look, he's going to yell at me for this, they're expecting that, then it'll become the silent treatment. So they completely change tactic, but for the same effect. So the next one thing is that as this person is being prepared, because they've started to learn and normalize to these kind of behaviors and what's going to happen, the person never feels prepared, because that's part of the coercive control, is to keep them on tenterhooks. So that person, no matter what they do, how good a meal you cook, if the meal is the problem, it's never going to be right. It's a goal that they can never achieve. And over time, what happens is they lose a sense of self and they lose a sense of agency. And all of this becomes completely exhausting. It's breaking a person down slowly. And then once that loss of self-belief happens, that person tends to submit to the offender in any shape or form. And as I said before, there's no goal on this. The offender's part in this is not that once she's doing the cleaning as I want her to and doesn't answer back or whatever is that they're thinking that they're going to do, that there's no motive to this. There's no agenda. There's no end game. It just continues and escalates. And then after a lot of this has happened is where the physical violence comes in. So thinking back, that a lot of people's assumption is that that's the first point. That's why a lot of people have the response of, why doesn't she leave? Because if somebody just randomly hit you, you probably would. But when it's become part of something that's been growing and normalizing, that's when you don't. And that's when the perpetrator or the offending partner has total control. And what's key in this is a lot of people try to find answers and how to, if you can find the cause and the answer of why it happens, you can address it. But there isn't a cause and there isn't an answer. It's just somebody's behavior and what they believe is their right and whatever makes them feel like that they're a better person or they're a bigger man or whatever in terms of doing this. But it is about control. And a lot of some of these, and why I could talk about the unexplained motive is that a lot of women, when they come for support, are looking for the answer to that. What is it I'm doing wrong? When actually they're not doing anything wrong. It's just something that's inexplicable. And this is why I wanted to talk about this, because this is why we need to move away from the patch-up side of helping women only and start moving into the perpetrator side, because we have to address these behaviors and why people do it, because only they know why and only they can stop that behavior, other than when we look at punitive measures like going to prison for serious offences. But think of this, that about 80% of abuse is non-physical. So we suspect that might be higher if everybody reported sexual abuse, but a lot of women choose not to. They choose not to talk about it. Therefore, so we can't capture that. But generally speaking, in my experience, about 80% of the clients that I see have not ever been touched physically. And that is really quite an interesting aspect when we start looking at comparing it to the assumptions that people have about domestic and family violence. So one thing I just want to make clear is that at the basis for any abuse is what we are now calling, is now termed coercive control, and we're understanding it better. Most people actually start unknowing what coercive control is. The reason why this is important is because in the past, there was no recourse or redress for coercive control. All of this 80% of non-violent behaviour just went unattended. But now, starting from July in New South Wales at least, that there are going to be laws that come into it. We don't know how they're going to really play out, but at least it's a start in the right direction, because all of those people who have their lives literally taken away from them, but never physically assaulted, couldn't get the help that they needed. So some of the things that we need to bear in mind about coercive control too, because as I said beginning, I'm covering an aspect that I want to open people's minds to say that domestic and family violence is not just intimate partner violence. There are other intersections and factors. And the same with coercive control. So when we look at some of them, ways that we look at it, an intimate partner is within the family. At home can be anybody. So that could be a flatmate. Sometimes it's a neighbour, but it could be extended family. It could be somebody who visits, a close friend. I've had clients who have told me about their husband's friend that often comes and visits and has dinner with them, but they always argue after he's left. So it's still within the domestic situation, although the person who's really doing the coercive controlling isn't necessarily the husband in the first instance, it's the friend. So we have to keep our minds open to that. When it's happening in education, we generally call this bullying at school. So within schools, within universities, there's been a lot of talk about this, but we have to understand that as an individual, there could be other aspects of their life where they are getting falling for this behavior. At work, we call it bullying and harassment. In institutions nowadays, the new term that is bandied about is corporate bullying or corporate harassment, but it follows the same kind of fundamental principles that I explained in the last slide, that someone has a strategy or a tactic to dominate or control or intimidate somebody else. And if you think about all these situations, that is exactly what happens here as well. The other thing is that within our systems, we talk about systemic abuse, and this is a term that we come across quite a lot. But when a system is set up that it actually manipulates a person into further negative consequences, or doesn't help them recover, then that basically becomes a problem within our governance as well. And it's still coercive control, because if a court tells you to do something and you know it's not in the best interest of your child or not in your best interest, and you're not listened to, then you have no choice. You are dominated, you are insubordinated. So these are some of the areas that we have to start thinking about, that in their own right within domestic and family violence, but also in our lives, that need to change, and we need some proper systems in place. Ultimately, when we look at things like when a person's absolute movements and their activities are controlled, we start looking at that in terms of trafficking or slavery. So again, it doesn't stop the intimate partner violence if somebody's been trafficked or in slavery. That might be on top. But people who are becoming more vulnerable are then more vulnerable to being bullied or having some other kind of abuse within their environment, because, like I said before, their own coping mechanisms are reduced. The way that they manage themselves or seek help, they become more isolated in their own mind and in their own lives if somebody is controlling them. And I'm not going to go into asking you all to, think of a situation, because I'm sure that something has come to mind, whether you're at school or at work, where a situation is presented and you say, well, yes, I can see how that coercive control is now underlying and underpinning all of that. So essentially, control comes in many, many forms. And when we work in domestic and family violence, we have to be mindful, one, of the trauma that the person is undergoing in the first place, some practical ways that we help them, and also whether there's anybody else that is within in the sphere of their matrix or networks of people who may also be exerting influence, such as some women have said, I'd love to ask my boss for a raise because I know other people have had one, but I just don't dare to. They don't feel confident enough and comfortable enough, having already been abused, to say to their employer, look, I'm doing the same job as the person next to me. Can I get the same pay? And I'm not talking about the gender pay inequity there. I'm just talking about generally where people do get pay rises and they know that they can get more money. But what we have to start thinking about now in forms of, when we talk about addressing domestic and family violence, is really about looking at a person overall. So we call it, some people talk about wraparound services, some people talk about client-centric or client-focused, but really we're talking about individuals with lives, and in their lives are lots of things: children, family, health, employers, you name it. And that's where we don't want to get bogged down with some of the definitions of the past, because they limit us in what we can do in response. And we want to open those responses to holistic recovery and healing, and not just an aspect of, here, you're homeless, we found you some accommodation. That's the bit that we need to move away from and start developing further tactics. One of the things that we do deal with a lot, and I'm just going to cover a few of the people that we deal with and why they become more vulnerable. And this is where temporary visas, which you may have heard of in the news, are talked about a lot. But basically, some of the additional intersections that these people face are, one, an instability. People in family violence situations generally feel unstable and don't know what's going to happen in the medium to long term. So that sort of anxiety is always there. But when you, as a new person in Australia, don't know how long you're going to stay here, whether you're going to stay here permanently or not, then that adds another level of insecurity. Then there's often the uncertain future. Am I ever going to get my residency, or am I not? Should I be paying more money? What's going to happen? A lot of people will be very fearful of anybody in that control realm to say, you know, if you don't do this, you're going to get deported. I'm going to complain about you. Your visa's going to be taken off you and you're going to get deported. And people often say, well, you know, you should know that that's not going to happen. But it's very scary for someone who's in a country on a temporary visa to think that, oh, well, I don't know how the system works, because not everybody knows everything about migration systems. And even migrants who came 20 years don't know what the current migration system is. So there's a genuine fear there. There's a whole raft of ways that, and greater opportunities for undetected abuse, because people won't speak up about it. Often they don't know that it's abuse. They don't know their rights. So there's a greater opportunity for abuse. And when we looked at a lot of the early clients that we had, which were largely students and on temporary skilled visas, we found that employers, landlords, educators were all part of the abuse network, that they were within the multiple perpetrator sphere. These people often try to stay under the radar. So when I talked earlier about becoming insubordinate, this is ultimately, you know, an abuser's kind of it helps them abuse in a much better way if they know that the person is already compliant and they won't speak up and they won't complain to anybody. So it kind of emboldens the perpetrator to know that they're going to get away with it, that nobody's going to question them, and there'll be no penalties afterwards. And this is why we say, and obviously for a lot of people who are temporary on temporary visas, sometimes the language and cultural barriers are quite significant. Students and skilled migrants do come with a level of English, but that doesn't mean they understand the systems. It's a common mistake that people make, and even people who you know, have mental health issues or have intellectual disability. Speaking English is only one part of it. You need to understand the context of what somebody's telling you and the consequences of what happens for you. And that's why we talk about the language and cultural barriers, but also not just the English part, it's the contextualization and the understanding of systems. So for a lot of these people, there are actually no formal support services. And the support services that we see have got major gaps in. This is a slide that I created maybe 10 years ago, and it hasn't changed much since. I still use it in the same way, because if we can fix the gaps for this cohort of people, we can actually service everyone much better, because these are major, major gaps. So that's why I focused on the language and cultural barriers, because people just assume it's because people don't speak English. No, people who speak English fall through the gaps all the time. If anybody's ever been through any guardianship process, you will understand just how difficult it can be, even as a local person who speaks English well. So there's that community, and then all of the other things that happen for people when they are on either on a temporary visa, but even after you get your residency, there are a lot of barriers and intersections that people have to deal with. So we think about a temporary visa, then you get your permanent residency. So most of us here probably are citizens, and we don't really need to worry about those sort of things. But nowadays, even when you become a permanent resident, there's a waiting period for you to get support. So as a temporary resident, you have to pay additionally for medical, any other sort of support services. But even after becoming a resident, there's a waiting period. Similarly, if you're somebody who's been here a long time, but you go for housing, the housing waiting lists just grow. They don't get any shorter, they just keep growing. Education can be interrupted. For people who come from a different country, their child might be 8-year-old going to school over there, and then they're an 8-year-old going to school here. There's a big adjustment for them there. If you've got domestic and family violence in the situation, that adds the intersections for the child and for the parents. But again, with domestic and family violence, interrupted schooling is very common, where somebody has to move from place to place to place to stay safe. The children have to move too. Sometimes the children miss school because they can't go to school because the other partner will know where the mother is. So all of these intersections have to be taken into consideration when we're talking to people and also looking at solutions for them. For some people, the vocational skills, women in particular, you know, have gaps in their working life and then go back to doing something that they didn't intend to do in the beginning of their career. They thought they were going to have a career in maybe law and then find themselves, you know, behind all the other lawyers, and therefore they have to take a lesser role. So the mismatch to ability, and also again with domestic and family violence, if you have to move or you're not allowed to work in certain places, or because these days we do hear a lot of women being accused as being the perpetrator of the offence because the partner has been smart enough not to be violent, but the day she sort of speaks up or throws something or yells, he's called the police, she's the perpetrator, she's in court. And so that can really affect their ability to work as well. So if you get a criminal conviction, you may not be able to work in, say, the community sector or the health sector. So these are things that affect you. Another thing that we have is medical conditions. One of the lowest diagnosed conditions that we have for people in domestic and family violence is a brain injury. We talk about mental health and what it does to mental health, but what we don't appreciate until you hear some of the specialists, and there's some really good presentations around. I would really encourage you to understand this. But those small jarrings to a head, a bit like sports players, it's equivalent. And a brain injury will cause someone to behave and act in different ways, which then again is used against them. So it becomes again part of this coercive control of that manipulating and leveraging of somebody's insecurity or weakness, or then an injury, and then leveraging off that. So for women who need it, we see commonly that women that need medical attention, if there has been a physical incident, it will be delayed, and it's delayed so that there's no evidence built up. And this is part of the coercive control, saying, when you feel better, I'll take you to the doctors, which kind of sounds ironic, but a lot of people say, yeah, when I'm feeling better, I'll go to the doctor. And then the bruises have gone down, the injury's not as bad. So when you get to the doctor, even if the person is not in the room with you, what is spoken to the doctor is very much less than what should have been told to the doctor. I won't go into the single people too much, but one of the things that we're seeing growing is the seniors abuse, where one partner dies and the children are now responsible for mum or dad. And as many people think it's all goodwill and they're taking care of mum and dad, but mum and dad no longer have a choice. They don't have a choice where they live. They don't have a choice where they go, especially if they've helped kids out with money and buying property. And one of the things that we're seeing growingly is that if one sibling is looking after mum and dad, or mum and dad is living with them, then they control their interaction with the other siblings, how much they phone the other siblings, how much, you know, when they go over for their birthdays. And this causes a lot of trauma for people because they don't like to, one, say negative things about their children, but even more so about that one child who is taking them to their medical appointments, and, you know, the grandchildren fix them a cup of tea. So they feel guilty to accuse the person of saying, you're not letting me see my other children, or see, you know, having that social network with them. So another thing that can happen is that seniors can get really chronic conditions before they're diagnosed. This idea that, oh, I don't want to trouble you. We do see over time that, oh, I haven't got time to take you to the doctors today. I know you need a specialist appointment, but I don't have a gap in my work diary for another 2 weeks. And over time, that condition can become chronic. So if they don't get the right kind of supports to go and see the doctors at the right time and medical support, that also becomes an issue. How this fits into coercive control is that when we take away, when I mentioned earlier that when a person's agency is removed, that's when they are under the control of someone else, and this can be one of the outcomes. So again, just looking sort of broader than just that narrow element of family violence, just to sort of think about the other things that are going on. And unfortunately, we've had clients where it's not just the person that comes in, the client who's facing family violence, but their parent is, one of their parents are. So they're trying to help their parent while they're trying to help themselves. And so there's multiple traumas going on at the same time. And this can be really quite complex. It starts to become like a web. I mean, we do training courses for certain groups of people to try and understand what those relationship networks, how they operate, so that to better understand clients when they're dealing with them in an aged care environment, in an NDIS environment, or in domestic and family violence. So a lot to think about. Some of the things that I want you just to go across is, we've talked about the forms of abuse before in that list that I put up. And I don't want to just go through the list again, but some of the cultural abuses that we come across, and this is where, you know, I do these presentations, because not just to broaden the scope of understanding of what actually contributes to what is family violence, but also some of the cultural aspects. So dowry abuse, some of you may have heard or may not, but this is a big one within South Asian communities, where a woman's family pays a lot of money for her to be married to a man, and then there's ongoing abuse along with to try and get more dowry, more money. And that again also happens over time. People think of dowry as in a large payment at the time of wedding, which it might be, but those smaller amounts, you know, we need a deposit on a car, we need to pay off a loan or credit card debt, it starts to add up. And the research we did in Parramatta only a year ago showed that anything from $50,000 to $200,000 women were handing over to their partners, which was dowry abuse. But I want you to also think about an overlay to that, because these days, the same kind of activities happen with scam relationships. Scam relationships are a $40 billion loss to people across the world today, and it is growing every day because it exploits people's vulnerability of wanting to get into a relationship. But the practice happens exactly the same as in dowry abuse. Honor-based violence is a little bit more complex in that it does not involve one person or one family. It actually involves an entire community. Forced marriage you may have heard of, and a lot of people confuse forced marriage with arranged marriage. Arranged marriages are by agreement and consent. A forced marriage is not. So they're very different. Sexual servitude, when we talk about this in the wider community, we generally associate this with trafficking and sex slavery, but this happens within extended families. So within a cultural abuse sense, the sense of a cultural abuse, this is a woman may be expected to sleep with a father-in-law, a brother-in-law, or even a friend. In Australia, we've seen that people will make them do that. Domestic servitude is not a new one. Everybody knows what that is, and many women would say that we all do that to some degree. But real domestic servitude in the cultural sense is where that person is married into the family only to service everybody's needs, possibly sexual as well, but generally in terms of will cook all the meals, clean everything, do all the chores, have no rights and no say in the family, and no say over their own destiny either. Economic abuse, many different forms of, but essentially the one that we see is having no personal income. You've probably heard of some of those stories where women say, I didn't even have enough money to buy sanitary towels. That's at an extreme level, but there are lots of levels in between that of what women are allowed to do with their money. And we've seen people who are very wealthy and very well dressed, but clients have told us, but you wouldn't believe, I don't have enough money to buy milk. I get everything in the house, and only what's in the house I use. I wear what I'm bought. I don't have any self-determination whatsoever. The other one that we come across at times is female infanticide or feticide. Feticide, not so much here, but in overseas you'll see it. But we do see, sorry, not infanticide, but feticide, because we do see women have abortions when they know they're carrying a female fetus. We know this is happening in Australia, and we do encourage women to get the right sort of advice and to try and gain some agency over this. Some areas in New South Wales Health won't tell women of South Asian backgrounds what the sex of their child is. they'll just say we can't see it because they're fearful that they might go and abort the child because they've already seen them abort too previously when they've had fetuses. Femicide, we hear about this, unfortunately, too often. 1 woman a week killed, and the statistics keep going up. So that's another one. There's another one within South Asian communities called dowry death, and that is where a woman is either killed or is coerced to commit suicide to end the marriage. So when a dowry has been asked for and the person thinks there's no more to have, they often try to bring that woman. It's not so much a killing anymore because that comes with penalty and it can be identified. But what we're seeing in Australia is that women are brought to the point of, if I wasn't around, wouldn't it solve everyone's problem? And they start to believe that, and they start going down that path. And coerced suicide is something that we do see. We're seeing more and more of, as in, because when we talk about mental health and we say this person's really struggling, you know, but how close they are really at believing that their families, their partner, their children, and everyone would be much better off without them. And you have to understand that in some ways, suicide is an honourable way out in some cultures. It's not considered a coward's act. It's considered an honourable and self-sacrificing act to help others. So we do at times have to talk to women a lot to try and work out where their heads are really at in terms of whether they are starting to see themselves as the problem and not looking for help. Okay. So some of the challenges that I have already talked about for women who are from culturally diverse communities is language, culture, numerous aspects, some of the ones that I've just spoken about in the previous slide. Racism, this is always subjective in a way that people see that you can take anything to be racist or not. But unfortunately, I think there's more and more evidence now that women who are of colour, women who are from culturally diverse backgrounds, do incur more racism within the system when they're trying to get help, which also then compromises the support to them. A lot of them feel like they're second-class citizens. If they're a temporary resident migrant, then generally they are. They don't have anywhere near the same options or rights as citizens and permanent residents. Systemic failures is probably a common one because the system fails so many people in so many different ways that it's just not enough to cover here. And then there's whatever's happening here versus what traditionally has happened for them back home. So they're starting to work in a system here, believing that it works in the same way as home, and that can often relate to complications. So the way they approach the police or what they expect from the family court is impacted by them actually believing something that isn't true. And then they have cross-jurisdiction problems. And this one really becomes problematic when one partner takes a child back home, because most of the Indian subcontinent nations, South Asian nations, are not signatories to the Hague Convention. So if your partner takes your child away, getting that child back is nigh on impossible unless they change their mind. The other thing is women's agency in general. For a lot of women that we talk from culturally diverse backgrounds, they come from places where violence against a woman is just not considered to be a crime. And even if it is a criminal offence in the legal system, the fact that it's not acted on still means that people get away with violence against women as a norm. So their head is in that place of, look, that's what my lot is. I just have to deal with it. They don't have as many legal status or rights as men, and they believe that to be true here. And for a lot of culturally diverse women, when they see the men in their relationships hanging around with politicians and being invited to dinners and being called community leaders, that reinforces the fact that they don't have as many rights, because they come from a place where if you hang around with politicians, you've got influence. And if you've got influence, the other person is going to be at a disadvantage. Unfortunately, sometimes the identity is linked to a man. So some women have their father's name in the passport. Without that, they wouldn't get a passport. And then later on, they get their husband's name. And if there isn't a husband, then a son's name. But it's really difficult when they are linked to that male identity. The other thing is that women perpetrating against women is not to be dismissed, because a lot of the abuse that happens in multi-perpetrator scenarios is by other women. So that would be mostly the mother-in-law or sister-in-law are the two key ones that we hear about, and they will be part of the perpetration. So some of the abuse and the physical violence has, we've seen here, been taken place by the women. So when the husband, if the woman goes to the police, the husband is asked, has he done anything? He hasn't done anything. He hasn't touched her. It might be part of the coercive control, but he hasn't physically touched her. And they don't generally, we've only seen one case of a mother-in-law being arrested for any kind of violence. In all the other situations that we know of, there've never been any charges laid. And the last one is about the woman's position in the family. Some families, healthy families, I would say, relationships are about a woman is the provider of the next generation. She is privileged and, to be nurtured and looked after. But for other women, it's domestic servitude. And when you think about this, for women who end up being by themselves outside of their home, then they start to have real difficulty making decisions for themselves. Sorry. I'm not going to go through that list because I think you all have probably seen that. This is the DV response. We still live in a world where separation versus remaining is the key response. And we don't really want to be talking in those terms anymore, because even all of my Western friends, and I've lived in Australia for 30 years, do not think the first response to a problem in a relationship is to leave. So we need to understand that there may be earlier interventions and a lot of things that we can do to help people stay in a relationship if that's what they choose, or if a relationship is in trouble. Not everybody is a perpetrator. That's the other thing. Sometimes people just have disputes. Very quickly, I'm just going to put this up to say, if you're somebody who's looking for help, I'm not going to explain that slide. I just want you to get an idea of that's how difficult it is to go out there. So we have the numbers that we can ring, and then we can have people that we can talk to. But when you're navigating someone to walk them through everything from government departments to funded agencies to volunteer organizations, faith-based organizations to commercial enterprises like migration agents and lawyers, it's a pretty overwhelming situation for anyone to be in. So that pretty much brings me to the conclusion of my presentation. And thank you for being so patient. I hope that wasn't too quick either.
No, thank you so much, Kittu. Lots of information. I have, done a DV training years ago, but we always need that refresher, and I really loved just the sensitivity that we get around what is acceptable and non-acceptable ways of working with it. And I'm really glad that you reiterated again that idea about it's not just about leave. From a therapist perspective, I just have to make sure that I never bring that doesn't, it's not implied, because I'll never say it, but it's not even implied, So I know that the woman's feeling a lot of shame already that she's in that situation. So any hint of that can just be so damaging. So thank you for reiterating that. So I'm going to go to Helen and Ollie, see if either of you. So these two women are friends of mine who are therapists, and I thought it'd just be great to invite them in just to see if there's any questions that any of you may have, maybe a client issue, and then if there's time, I'll bring my client situation in. Okay, sure. Over to you, Helen.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And as Faith said, it's just great to have it reinforced and the complexity of it brought front of mind. I've actually got a case at the moment where the client is the child of an abusive father and probably the family system in general, but it's really coming to a head, and it's I wouldn't have put it in this category of domestic family violence or abuse, but having listened to the presentation, sort of seeing the complexity of the extended, so she's got a stepsister and the stepsister's been sexually interfered with, and just the ripple effect on my client of how much. I suppose, I am getting a lot of support around this client because I feel a little bit out of my depth, to be honest. But I don't know. I think my question is really, I'm dealing with it. She's only 21, but she's a child, really. And she's had this abusive father for all her life. And her mother doesn't cope very well either. So I think the mother's also been in, the mother's holding a lot of the characteristics that you're talking about. Is there any suggestions about when you can see the ripple of the family and yet the client is the child?
And I think you've raised a really good point, and something Faith said earlier is that, and probably I should have included, is the guilt part. So for a lot of people, that guilt is the barrier. They hold the guilt. Children definitely hold the guilt. They think that they're responsible for whatever their parents do. And if you look at it from a simplistic point of view, children get told off and there's arguments when they do something wrong. So when something like this happens, they naturally start to feel that I'm doing something wrong and I'm contributing to the situation, even though they're not. So my advice would be to, first of all, think about where that person is in terms of what guilt they feel. But what you're describing to me sounds like a perfect candidate for family conferencing if they're up for it. And this is not something that people, think that, going to a psychotherapist or psychologist for a few sessions is going to help me fix problems. It doesn't. Family conferencing is the same. It is about exploring the relationships, exploring how you work together. I said before that I'm a qualified family dispute resolution practitioner, but I don't mediate because it limits me legally as to what I can and can't do. DV can't do it. Sorry, go away. So I don't, but I've got those skills and I use those to help people reconcile, but also to understand. And I think one of the hardest things for everyone is you can't change what you can't change. You can change yourself. You can't change other people. You can't always, we can't change the system. So learning to, one, deal with the guilt, accepting the system is the one that we all have to live in, and then moving on to saying, this is my life and this is the part where I take back control. So I talked a lot about control and other people controlling, but excuse me, it's really about taking back control of whatever you can, whether it's your day-to-day going for a walk, how you speak to your sister, and you can't force people into bringing them in and saying, look, I know you're being affected, so because I'm recovering like this, you need to recover like this. That's where family conferencing comes in quite well, because you'll identify those people who do recognize, actually, we're in the same boat, let's do this together, against those who are like, I'm not accepting that there's a problem in the family, you're just nuts. I'm not going to buy into it. So it really does help to, with a good family conferencer, to work that out so you can either work together or work individually.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you. That's
no worries.
Yeah, spot on. Thank you.
You're on mute.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in quickly and put mine in, Holly, before you go in, because I promised my client I'll ask this question. So clients come, DV situation, well, history of DV with the marriage. She's left now. They've got a 5-year-old, shared parenting. The 5-year-old a few months ago started to say, things around daddy's touching my TP. Very, very concerned. Spoke to DCJ. She's done a number of reports. Nothing's come back as nothing. We can't find anything. So it's been thrown out. So, and part of me feels like whatever's going on is kind of an attempt for the ex to still control her. That's kind of what I'm kind of sensing. But what her thing is that it's coercive control. So therefore, she doesn't have and she can't put in an AVO. There's a lot of emotional abuse still, like a lot, and he does it through the child. And I just wondered, is it true that in New South Wales you can't ask for an AVO?
You can.
For coercive control, because she said it's
no,
not
not for coercive control.
Okay.
You see, it kind of, there's a few things there. One is the child protection aspect.
Yeah.
Why aren't the authorities taking it more seriously? I know, again, we talk about broken system. This is where the broken system is telling us this, but still, she should document it. Every time her child tells her, whatever he tells her, try not to, videoing is not always a great thing because children start to feel like they need to,
perform. Yeah,
exactly. And don't put words in their head, just listen to it. I think one of the better things these days, if any of you have ever heard of the AI note-taking apps, speaking in English, it records what the person is saying, and it can do it sitting. I can have it on now and record all of you, and it will transcribe everything. Zoom does it. So rather than record a video a child and they feel like they perform, I think a good way is to build the evidence.
Yeah.
And that is the way of, not putting words in the child's mouth, but capturing the child's words.
Yeah.
And therefore going down the child protection path of saying, I think there's a problem here. Because what you want there is that you want DCJ to start stepping into the father and getting him into some programs to find out whether he is actually coercively controlling or whether this is just genuine child sex abuse.
Yeah, unfortunately,
in which case there's different ways to deal with it.
It's so frustrating for her because they finally, like I said, number of police reports, number of hospital visits, number of reporting, and I, as a mandatory reporter, had also put in a number of reports. But through all that, last week she got a thing from DCJ saying because of their resources, they have to let it go. They have to close the case. So it's just very frustrating for her because that was exactly what we were doing, which is documenting everything. I document absolutely everything. Just write it down verbatim. Don't add anything to what's been said. And I've been doing the same too, so that I've got the same information. So very frustrating.
But I think the other thing to remember is, and this is where we always think of a systemic intervention, is my fear also is that those hospital visits are traumatizing the child.
For sure.
And, sometimes you have to make the decision, if the system is not going to kick in, I need to stop traumatizing the child. So keep recording on a, one level, but write what you can, but maybe not take the child to, because they will start to associate with that. And that'll be another problem that comes further down the track. And that is the controller is now getting what they want. They are able to control your behavior.
Yeah, 100%. And we had that discussion as well around that, the trauma to the child. But I know we're nearly finished, but Holly, did you want to add anything?
I'm going to go because I've got a client.
Sure, you can see it.
Thank
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, no, I haven't actually got a lot to add, Faith. A lot of what I would ask has already sort of been covered. I guess, one aspect though, I do have clients that have been sexually abused, and even though they're adult clients and their families are aware, and it's just still swept under the rug. And I just, I guess this is a whole other chapter, but just coming back to, because we were talking about sexual abuse, it just made me think that there's no going forward for that family unless the victim is prepared to act like it never happened. They can't attend Christmas, they can't attend family events, etc., etc. Anyway, but that's a whole other aspect. But I mean, look, I was very excited when the coercive control law came into effect in New South Wales. That was a big deal. I've obviously seen the effects that they can have, and I've also seen the effects of the men getting in first to try to create the narrative. Even with clients, I've seen clients being pushed to use violence through coercive control, and then them ending up getting arrested. And what I say to clients is what's already been said. Just document everything, write it all down. Don't tell him that you're seeing a therapist. Just keep everything separate. But it's a process, I guess. And it's
can I just mention on that, because we talk about documenting, but one of the things we've done from the beginning started with the language barrier, but we find it very effective, is that we do write reports and we do an assessment of DV in terms of, one, we define the domestic and family violence, like some of those terms, and then we pick out the elements of what happened, and that pattern we then describe. And we've had a lot of success in immigration with people successfully putting their case for domestic violence. But we've had 3 clients who have been to court as the perpetrator, and I won't say got off because, I don't want to undermine the legal system here.
Yeah.
But they have had reduced sentences or, had a good behaviour bond or something like that when they were looking at serious time. Because the manipulator was so clever that they'd really set them up to get them to that point.
Yes.
And so, but we were able to demonstrate that through an assessment report, which came, and look, it's still the same law and it's without coercive control laws, but judges will read that sort of stuff if it's presented. But the problem is most victims don't think of getting a specialist report.
No.
Defendants do.
Yes, and that's the thing. I mean, I do advise them to do that, but don't tell them that that's what's happening. You've got to keep all this well away from the perpetrator, so that it's, otherwise it's all undermined. Otherwise, the perpetrator will find a way to undermine that. So. Yeah.
It's interesting when we've actually presented these, because in an immigration report, only immigration get to see it. The perpetrator never sees what we write. So does it give you, you can be more damning, if you like, in criticising the behaviour, if I can put it that way. But in local court, in the family court, you can't, because that obviously that's going to go to the other side and they can pick it, the lawyers can pick it to bits. But what we found is that because we don't go into the emotive side, that's where we don't, we're practically non-trauma informed in that, to say factually, if somebody was impacted by a hand on the cheek, that is physical violence, end of domestic family violence. And it becomes factual to a point, but then we put a cultural assessment of it. But when you put it in like a timeline of events, judges will look at it and they're like, okay, now I know really what's going on, because no lawyer on stand with a witness, and I, as an interpreter, I go a lot. You cannot ask that level of questioning. If it's not in the statement, a police statement is very brief about one incident. So you don't get much of an opportunity to actually say, hey, I'm the one that's experiencing the control and the family
ongoing. Yes.
But
can I just ask,
that does work, and we need to move away from just giving them a report saying I'm seeing a psychotherapist or something because it's helping my mental health, to going, hey, these are the facts.
I just need to ask about mandatory reporting, because that was certainly something that I came across, and other clients come across. They're very limited in the information they want to give away because of mandatory reporting and the fear of losing their children.
So what was the question?
So when they come and they report to you that they are experiencing physical violence, are they at risk? A lot of clients don't want to report the extent of the violence because they're afraid of losing their children. If the children are witnessing violence, and you're right,
I think that's probably a myth, because a lot of perpetrators are not violent to their children.
No, I'm aware that, but a lot of therapists may report an incident where they feel a child is witnessing violence, and that may stop, a victim from, I know it does stop victims from going into detail of the violence.
With the therapist you're talking about. You're saying with the therapist. Okay, so the victim may not say that much to the therapist because they worry the therapist may have to report because of mandatory reporting.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, because the child is witnessing violence.
That makes sense, Kittu? I'm just conscious of the time, though. It's 5 past. Kittu, do you have the time? Because I don't want us to take advantage of your time.
Another 5 minutes and we do. But look, I haven't experienced very much in the way of it's a negative experience. Even if you're a mandatory reporter, and we do tell clients that we do have to report, we're a mandatory reporter.
Right, that's all I wanted to get. I wanted to find that out, because do you come under that same? So it really makes it kind of doesn't make really any difference for the victim.
If anything, I would say that after mandatory reporting, we're rather disappointed that not much happens, to be honest, rather than the other way around.
That's definitely been my experience. It's very frustrating. And any time I've done it, nothing has ever happened. Very frustrating. So my
right.
client is always very worried about, because her previous therapist's notes was subpoenaed. He's very
Yes.
litigious, constantly taking her to court. She's always terrified about how I write notes. So
Yes.
I'm very conscious of not writing anything that's going to implicate her or her
Me
mental
too.
health. And that's another way of him controlling. Yeah.
Me too. I'm very
Mm.
aware of how I write my notes for that
Mm.
same
I think we
reason.
all are.
Yeah.
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 Okay, well
Okay.
let's round it up there. Look, if we've got any further questions, can we send people to you? I'm not sure how that would work.
We've got a website, and
Yeah,
on the front page is a referral form.
yeah, great.
It has got a bit of detail in it, but that just saves time rather than having
Yeah,
people who are traumatized, and then we've got to
yeah.
say, "Oh, tell me your,
Again,
your
yeah,
birth or whatever." So, but if
fantastic.
another worker can fill out the referral form, it's usually better than when the client does
Yeah,
it. But if you don't want to do
yeah,
it, the client can refer themselves if they don't
yeah,
want
yeah.
time. It's
I'm
fully
happy to do that.
confidential. We'll contact them, do an intake. And, if they need to be referred somewhere else, we will refer them. If it's something we can do, we will let them know. That rather mad slide that I showed you of what people can do,
Yeah,
it's
I took a
any one of those
little
things might
screenshot.
happen.
Yeah,
And I can send you that copy of that slide if you want.
that'll be great. Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you so much. Thank you so much for your time, Kittu. I certainly got a lot out of it. I wish that we had so much more longer with you.
It's all
But
right. Maybe another time. Thank you very
yes,
much. Thank you for your
thank you.
time.
Thank you.